2. Old-time religion in modern society. Time and time again in history we find crusades afoot, which act on the assumption that the public life of the culture has moved too far away from the moral precepts to which a number of citizens pay allegiance. In our days, we are once again confronted with such crusades, reinforced by the contemporary means of mass persuasion, the public media. Vocal minorities of several kinds seem bent upon exerting pressure on the political sector of this country. Among these are groups whose professed motivations are religious and whose program involves making the general citizenry conform to the moral ideal which these groups consider to be correct in light of their own religious convictions. From the depth psychological point of view, it seems that we are faced here with more than a mundane issue of contemporary public life. Rather, the activities of these minorities present a psychological and, in fact, a spiritual problem which merits our deepest concern. This chapter considers this set of temporal public phenomenon within a larger spiritual context, which involves not only the immediate psychological overtones of the present, but which leads as well to the contemplation of a much larger psycho-historical context. First, we must address the relationship of religion to the body politic or to social and public concerns in general. Religion may be defined as the effort of the individual human psyche to link itself up with its greater psychic background, to connect itself with spiritual and archetypal realities within its own deeper mind, indeed within the deeper mind of humanity, and thereby to facilitate a state of wholeness or totality arising within the psyche itself. This definition calls to mind the origins of the word religion. It comes from the Latin term re, meaning back or together, and legere, meaning to join. Religion comes from the same root as ligament, which in biology is designed to join things together. Thus, by definition, religion has to do with joining the individual soul to its background within a greater reality. We might also say, I think in a historical perspective, that for better or for worse, religion has always played an enormously important role in human society. For this reason, a historical, or rather a psycho-historical survey of the development of human consciousness can be very helpful here. Within such a survey, we can discover the authentic character, the roots, and the nature of our present situation. For the purpose of the analysis, I shall employ a scheme of development derived from the Jungian writer Erich Neumann, expressed in his works, The Origin and History of Consciousness and The Great Mother. Neumann's developmental scheme is useful in this instance primarily because it helps uncover the relationship between religion and the political life of societies. Phases of the growth of psyche in society. According to Neumann, certain phases denote the development of consciousness, or more properly, the growth of consciousness. The first phase or stage has been linked symbolically with the figure of the Ouroboros serpent or dragon, a tail-swallowing amphibian. The symbol represents the condition of original totality and self-containment which exists before the birth of consciousness or of the conscious ego. While development is in this phase, the ego exists only as a latent potentiality and is still identical with the totality of the objective psyche. Conscious and unconscious, ego and self, masculine and feminine are still one in this condition. In the individual, this state is presumed to exist during the prenatal period and in early infancy. Now, let us look at this phase, for our purposes, in political religious terms. The equivalent of the primordial, archaic unconsciousness of the embryo, or of the very small infant, would be primitive society. In primitive society, the individual and the collective are still one. The tribe, clan, or extended family is both religious and secular in character. Chiefs and kings are often divine, or at least ruled by divine right. All of life is religious or sacred in nature. The religious and the secular are not only unified, but not even the faintest concept exists that the two could be envisioned as different. All human acts, drinking, eating, sex, hunting, fighting, are sacred acts. Nothing is profane or mundane. Everything is charged with great archetypal import and force. In such a society, the gods live through the human being. Their communion with the human is so close and intimate. To speak of individual freedom under these circumstances is nonsensical, because there is no individual to be free. Archaic society is the individual's real self. Society and self are one, and without society, the individual perishes, just like an amputated limb dies when removed from the vitalizing system of the organism. Much of this description pertains also to slightly more developed forms of primitive society. A good illustration of this phase of society can be found in the idea of the great humanitarian Dr. Albert Schweitzer. He thought that modern hospital conditions were potentially alienating and psychologically harmful to the African natives to whom he extended his medical ministrations. Instead of isolating the sick patient and putting him or her into a hospital bed in a room alone or with strangers, Schweitzer allowed patients to move into his hospital with their families and their pets and domestic animals, including dogs, chickens, pigs, and the like. Needless to say, this arrangement did not enhance the hygienic conditions and the orderliness of the hospital, but it provided the African the kind of psychological support system without which he or she would not have improved physically and would assuredly have perished for psychological reasons. Schweitzer knew that a member of an undifferentiated society cannot survive psychologically outside the bosom of that society. The reality of personhood, with its consequent sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency, is simply not present in archaic societies. Lest we become prideful and inflated when comparing ourselves to members of such societies, we must remember that in spite of our modern civilized alienation, we are still very much partakers of conditions which, at a subtle level, resemble those of the primitive. Psychological support systems of a collective nature are still desirable, although we are no longer dependent on them to such an enormous degree as we once were. The cardinal feature of the primitive society we are describing is lack of differentiation. Just as the individual is not differentiated from the collective, the secular is not differentiated from the religious. The two are still one. While it is easy for us to infer the shortcomings of such a condition, we must not forget that the unification of these powerful forces also gives the people within such a society considerable psychological power or psychic energy. What it does not give them, however, is individual consciousness, since it is a pre-egoic phase of development. Although this phase is archaic, there are in fact many societies in the present world where this condition still prevails. Moreover, we need to remember that we moderns still carry within us the ancient memory of this condition. Consequently, we are not entirely removed from it ourselves. We hanker for it, as it were, on an unconscious level, even as we have an unconscious desire to return, not perhaps to the physical womb of our mothers, as some reductionistic psychologists claim, but rather to the womb of the unconscious. Somewhere in the background of all human thinking and feeling is the recognition that there was a time, maybe a time before time, when we were one, when the sacred and the secular were not separate, when every meal was a holy communion, when every act of life was a sacred ritual, when we dwelt within the all-enfolding, all-nourishing, and all-sustaining energy system of a great totality, a great ineffable wholeness, and experienced a wonderful feeling of energy, wholeness, protectedness, and oneness. The farther we move away from that ancient condition, the greater the longing, the nostalgia to return to a state of that sort. The childhood of consciousness. The next phase to consider is the infancy and childhood of consciousness. Within this epoch, consciousness is born, but, like most newborn beings, is very weak. Consciousness at this stage is dim, fitful, sporadic in its expression. An analogy that offers itself is that of a tiny flickering flame in a large dark space that is easily reduced to an imperceptible speck of light or even extinguished by a gust of air. The light of newborn consciousness is rather as if one were to take a little oil lamp out into a windswept and foggy heath, where the gusts may make it appear as if the little flame has been completely put out, until after the wind subsides, it flames up again. At the level or the growth of individual consciousness, this stage is usually equated with childhood. Human infants and children, unlike most animals, are helpless for a long time. Young children are dependent on the caring ministrations of their mothers in particular. Without mothers, children would perish. This is true psychologically as well as physically. In psychological terms, we might say that the unconscious, which is the psychic mother, remains in close touch with the child, nourishes it, supports it, and influences it. Therefore, children are very close to their unconscious, much closer than adults. For this reason, children are in very close touch with their dreams. They also have a sense of reality about their fantasies that adults do not have. By way of their unconscious, in its collective aspect, children are also in some kind of telepathic communication with the unconscious of their parents and appear to partake of it at times. That is why Jung had pointed out that parents ought to realize that not only their conscious and overt acts, but also their unconscious can influence their children. So let us say parents may discipline themselves not to argue or show hostility or outburst of temper in front of their children. But if they have a lot of hostility and anger or disturbance within their psyche, and if they are around their children, the children are likely to be affected by even unexpressed anger. It is not necessary to perform dramatic overt acts in front of a child in order for the child to get the point. Children are in such close contact with the Great Mother, unconscious, that the unconscious of their physical parents is accessible to them. As we look at this phase of development in social, political, and religious terms, we find that in this stage, society, religion, and politics, like the ego and the self, are beginning to separate, but only barely. In secular society, if any kind exists at all, priesthood, at this point frequently a feminine priesthood, is supreme. The gods are no longer identified with the priest-kings as they were before, although some divine kingship may still persist. Priesthood, however, is still the principal social office of mediatorship between gods and humans, and as such is very important. The devouring aspect of the divine is considered to be very present and threatening, and the priesthood is as much engaged in deflecting divine wrath as it is in securing the gifts and celebrating divine love. One is reminded in this context of the ancient Aztec civilization of Mexico, where the coming of solar eclipses and other unusual astronomical or natural phenomena were accompanied by human sacrifices. Analogous conditions existed in other civilizations, so in this phase of society, the consciousness of the cosmos and of universal being is seen as a threatening power, not only as a benevolent one. This duality is really the recognition, one might say, at a projected level, of the ambivalence, the coexisting good and evil nature of Psyche. The universe, like the Psyche, is not all good, not all bad, but both, and both qualities can come forth and manifest. Thus, the unconscious must be supplicated and appeased to nourish and support us, and its destructive and devouring aspects must be kept from harming us. Such supplications as an important aspect of this phase of religiosity, for it is, of course, religion that addresses itself to societal protection. Occasionally, of course, some advanced egos are born into this phase of society. They may try to challenge the vitally powerful, but at the same time dark and oppressive supremacy of the unconscious. But these individuals usually do not last, because they are out of harmony with the unconscious of the majority of people. The unconscious devours them, a pattern which persists for a very long time. Historically, we find that all cultures go through a similar phase, and that even today, many cultures are still heavily involved in this phenomenon. Time and again, the collective lack of consciousness devours the heroic consciousness that rises to challenge it. Socrates drank hemlock because he was an ego that had outgrown the collective, and therefore the political leaders, exponents of the collectivity, came to him and said, "You, Socrates, are teaching doctrines which amount to the corruption, the moral corruption of the young of Athens." These leaders had no television or other modern media with which to attack Socrates as they would today, but they were quite effective in carrying out their purposes nevertheless. In contrast to Socrates, the Hebrew prophets, with some exceptions of course, appear to have been agents of the great unconscious tyranny embodied in their God. The barely emancipated, rebellious ego of various kings, cities, and people were beaten into submission to the Jehovic archetype by the exhortations of its prophetic agents. It is difficult and often impossible for a heroic individual consciousness to succeed against the unconscious collectivity, especially in the developmental phase of culture we are describing. For example, the medieval emperors who rose against the popes never really succeeded. Why? Because the pope spoke for the unconscious collectivity, and the people were under the sway of the unconscious. The emperors, especially the cultured and enlightened Frederick II, tried to combat the power of the papacy and of the church, but they eventually ended up doing what came to be known as going to Canossa to kiss the foot of the Pope again. In this manner, the rebellious ego tries to rise against the unconscious, but cannot succeed. It then goes back, makes up, and bows to the unconscious once more. How often one sees this in one's childhood and early adolescence. How dearly we all would have liked to tell our parents to go to the deepest Dantean circle of hell, so that we could be sovereign and autonomous. But at this stage of development, we are still lacking in power, and thus we could not do it. So perhaps we told them all with great drama and bluster and kicked up a good fuss. Perhaps even ran away. But in the end, we came back and made up. After all, we still needed our meals. We still needed a bed to sleep in, and so we crawled back into the restrictive but still protective nest. The political analogies to this phase of development in many parts of the world are just as dramatic. Look at the recent and current situation in Iran. This archaic, backward country was taken over after a world war by a military officer who became Shah Reza I of the House of Pahlavi. He tried, like a good heroic ego, to do away with at least the worst manifestations of the dark unconscious. He tried to secularize the country by taking away the power of the mullahs and established a government independent of the domination of archaic, unconscious religious structures. His son, Shah Muhammad Reza, continued the task of civilizing, urbanizing, and educating, yet the backlash of the dark, chthonic archetypes of the unconscious could not be avoided. Out of his repressed exile in France came the black-clad, black-turbaned, black-souled Ayatollah Khomeini, like an avenging angel of the unconscious, a dark archetype risen from the pit. We all know what happened. The dark unconscious took over and established mullah rule, theocracy. It turned Iranian history back to the Dark Middle Ages. In other places, notably in Turkey, a similar development occurred, but without an effective backlash. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, affectionately called Kemal the Drunkard for his alcoholic defiance of the law of the Prophet, took over and secularized the country. He outlawed the fez worn by the men and tore the veil off the women, and told the clergy to be quiet and to keep quiet or else. Turkey is still not paragon of modern civilization and culture, but it is not a theocratic dictatorship like Iran. In many countries, this phase of the great unconscious mother unconscious, still predominates and keeps the freedom of the ego at a non-existent or at least minimal level. Examples are numerous. Not only the Islamic countries, but interestingly and paradoxically enough, the Marxist countries, where the materialistic religion known as Marxism-Leninism has taken over the role of the church, illustrate this phase. Many people don't recognize this fact. Religion, particularly unconscious, chthonic, archaic, old-time religion, comes in many guises. Even an atheistic religion like communism is still a religion in the sense that it takes over and demands total allegiance from individuals, just like the unconscious does. The Marxist-Leninist religion has its rituals, dogmas, and commandments. The party is the church. Its functionaries are the clergy. What the medieval church was in Europe, the Communist Party was in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, and remains so in countries such as Vietnam, Cuba, and China. The party chairman is the Pope. He is the superior of presidents, premiers, and the like, just as the Pope was the supreme overseer of empires, kings, and princes. And, of course, such countries have a most efficient inquisition. During the last World War, I had the opportunity of observing the political connoisseurs of the Red Army in action. It was an awesome experience. One could see staff officers of the rank of colonel shiver in their boots before the connoisseurs and their political police. One may imagine similar scenes during the era of the Inquisition, when knights and generals tremble before the cruel Dominican monks. Look around the world and observe where there is the least personal freedom. You will certainly single out the Islamic theocracies and the communist states. Why? because they are both dominated by religion. In one case, a theocratic ideology that has not progressed since the 6th century, and in the other, by an atheistic religion, following the prophets Marx and Lenin, and for that matter, Mao. All of these ideological tyrannies are in reality representatives of Great Mother Unconscious. Interestingly enough, these countries are always welfare states as well as tyrannies. The tyrannical welfare state is in fact the best symbol of Great Mother Unconscious. If you are a good kid, I will take care of you, says the Great Mother, embodied in the state. I will feed you. I will house you. I will give you work. If you don't toe the line, I will punish you, even devour you. I will put you into the concentration camp, into the gulag. I will sacrifice you, because after all, you are my child, and that means that you are a part of me. You cannot ever be an individual apart from me. Thus speaks the Great Mother Unconscious in her form as the tyrannical welfare state. In speaking so, she sounds just like a real, undeveloped, unconscious mother, of whom there are many. Such mothers never want to grant their children sovereignty or real individuality, but continue instead to regard their children as extensions of themselves, even when they are old and gray. In the same manner, the totalitarian state always suppresses the individuality of its children. The motto of the totalitarian state is, I am mother, and mother knows best. To this you may add, and mother will get you if you are not good as she decrees. By painting this picture of the unconscious, I don't mean to imply that the vital portion of the psyche is exclusively or even primarily negative in its relationship to the conscious ego. Assuredly, the unconscious is the source of creativity, inspiration, and psychic energy. Because of this, the ego is in great need of adequate avenues of access to the unconscious. By the same token, we need to be aware that our unconscious selfhood, including the collective unconscious or objective psyche, is characterized by ambivalence toward the conscious ego. Mother Unconscious, as we call it, is devouring as well as nourishing, obscuring as well as illuminating, because it contains all polarities and can manifest them as it chooses. The tyrannical welfare state, as a metaphor for a particular aspect of the unconscious, needs to be understood within such a wider context. The Patriarchal Period. The third phase of the growth and development of individual psyche and culture is what Erich Neumann refers to as the Patriarchal Period, or the phase of the Great Father, or the Spiritual Father. In the psychic life of the individual, this phase concerns the rising of the power of the ego and the consequent ascendancy of the conscious ego over its opposite number, the unconscious. At this point, the unconscious is increasingly rejected and depreciated. The rational ego creates its own goals and disciplines, which inevitably strive for personal independence, will, and sovereignty. The political implications of this phase, I think, are most interesting because they have a deep and direct bearing upon our own civilization, culture, and systems of government. Now, we must remember that, in the main, religion is the representative of a greater unconscious background in every culture. Thus, it is understandable that the first element or force with which the newly sovereign ego is likely to clash is religion, in whatever form it may exist in a particular society. In order to emanate itself from the thraldom of the unconscious and its archetypes, the ego establishes, works for, or tries to establish, a secular political structure which is emancipated from the establishments of religion. The kings of the absolutist era refused to bow to the Pope and ruled their kingdoms without deferring to ecclesiastical power. The preference of absolutist monarchs for Protestantism as a form of religion, as manifest in Germany and in England, can be traced back to this psycho-historical moment. Some reliance on religious symbols and moral precepts remained, but the crucial difference was that the state was regarded as a legitimate power in its own right, which did not have to rely on the grace and approval of the religious power. In this phase, the state no longer derives its authority and justification from a supernatural, transcendental, religious mythos of some kind. The Renaissance period in Europe, and subsequently the Reformation, which freed secular rulers from ecclesiastical domination and control, were the real beginnings of this development in Western society. These developments were succeeded by the era of the Enlightenment and, finally by the turbulent era of the French Revolution, during which the idea of popular sovereignty and individualism was advocated, although perhaps not implemented all that successfully. This brings us to the situation in the United States. The American colonies, which separated themselves from the British mother country, were the offsprings par excellence of the era of the Enlightenment. The U.S. Constitution asserted the de-establishment of religion, or as it is popularly described, the separation of church and state. The state vowed to be and to remain free and above religious disputes and principles, while allowing complete freedom of religion to its citizens. These principles led in America to a flowering of religious movements and sects perhaps unprecedented in history. The dire predictions of older religious establishments, such as the Roman Catholic Church, to the effect that a secular state would lead to the death of religion and to moral degradation, were not fulfilled. On the contrary, America became a very religious country, in which religion flourished, but in a new way. The new way of religion in America was an individual way, a way of highly pluralistic personal religiosity. We may say that religious life in America came to combine the highly individualistic attitudes of the ego with the search for the values of the unconscious as represented by religion itself. The devouring, repressive aspects of Mother Unconscious, manifesting as Mother Church, were greatly mitigated against by the state, which guaranteed the possibility of religious freedom and, to the best of its ability, guarded this freedom for its citizens. Probably not since Hellenic Rome and Alexandria has there been such a combination of individualism and religion as has been seen throughout the history of the United States. For 1,500 years or more, such a phenomenon was not seen in Western society. While religious plurality no doubt has its shortcomings, its advantages were and are, I think, enormous. In fact, they are so great that they cannot be exaggerated. The Integrative Phase. The essentially individualistic and libertarian religious life of the people of the United States has an important potential relationship to the fourth phase of the growth and development of the psyche, which Erich Neumann called the Integrative Phase. Neumann's theory declares that the father-oriented, ego-dominated patriarchal phase leaves the individual one-sided and incomplete. Important psychic elements which may have feminine overtones have been repressed and neglected. Consciousness and ego have been overvalued, and the non-rational, unconscious side of life has been depreciated. Individuality and personality have been exalted at the expense of the feeling-tone values of relatedness, emotion, and community. Having wandered far and long from the unconscious homeland, the ego in this phase feels like a motherless child. So another change or transition to an integrative phase is needed to redeem these neglected psychic elements. How does this transition manifest at the political level? Beginning in the 1930s or 40s, the public philosophy of the United States increasingly began to move away from the individualism of the era of the Enlightenment and of the Industrial Revolution. We may regard this movement away from the rugged individualism as an indication of the beginnings of the integrative phase in the psychohistory of this country. At the same time, one is bound to admit that these stirrings of the integrative phase remained, in the main, rather confusing and confused. While an increasing number of cultured and well-meaning persons were beginning to see the need to recover the neglected psychic elements of the culture, the ways in which they went about this task produced many counterproductive results. The growth of the welfare state brought with it the rise of an inefficient and soulless bureaucracy and clumsy and exceedingly costly apparatus of administrative governmental organs, which became a veritable millstone around the neck of American society. Many people became childishly dependent on the ministrations of the welfare state and regressed into mass-mindedness and unconsciousness. The educational methods and system broke down, bringing widespread custodial care of young persons to whom not even the most essential elements of education were offered. The educational process became largely a mockery and a sham. The fanciest and most expensive public school systems in the world turned out vast numbers of functional illiterates and still continue to do so. Once again, the analogy between the psychological development of the individual and the culture holds true. When the pressure within the field of the ego mounts toward the need to integrate unconscious content, the possibility always exists that this unconscious content will not be consciously integrated, but will instead overpower the ego and cause a psychic regression. Thus, the impulse to move forward causes a step backward, as it were. Instead of becoming more conscious, the person becomes increasingly unconscious. Similarly, when the neglected side of society given a chance to come forward, it can easily happen that things get out of hand and that various regressive and chaotic conditions prevail. From this, it appears that the integrative phase of the psycho-historical growth of the culture of the United States has proceeded very laboriously. At the same time, we must recognize, I think, that this phase, if it has indeed arrived at all, is of very recent origin. Therefore, to view these developments in the perspective of a mere 50 years is a mistake. It has taken hundreds, indeed thousands of years for civilization to go through these phases, or to pass from one to another. What is needed at the present time is a very philosophical, serene, and detached view of these developments. Instead of allowing ourselves to be thrown into a frenzy of excitement because of the conditions existing around us, we have to see that the social, political, and historical processes occur in time, and since it is a process within time, it takes time. It would be as realistic to imagine that from one year to the next, a new age has burst upon the world in which all things have rapidly changed to a paradisical condition, as it would be to regard the growing pains and confusions of the present era as indicating a frightful decadence and decline of the moral, intellectual, political, and economic character of the culture. Time and timelessness are one of the great pairs of opposites of our psyche. The ego functions in time. The unconscious exists outside of it. Thus, we tend to look out into the world from the watchtower of our own archetypes, our own unconscious, and expect that this outer world will be able to conform in such a fashion to the expectation of this interior, deeply unconscious vision. In the unconscious, things can happen without the intervention of time and the imposition of space. The individual who is motivated by the archetypal realities of the unconscious can be heard to exclaim, "There is no reason whatsoever why we couldn't make a perfect society right now." Of course, there is no reason why one couldn't make a perfect society in one's head, in one's mind right now, but there are plenty of good reasons why one cannot create a such condition in the outer world. There is time to contend with, and there are a multitude of circumstances and forces working against one and against each other. A fiat arising out of the mind cannot change the world in the twinkling of an eye. Idealistic persons tend to expect their projections to assume a physical reality in the outer world very rapidly and without difficulty. This, of course, does not happen. Thus, the impatient idealist is always disappointed and dejected. One of the great stumbling blocks in the path of the growth and development of our culture within the context of an integrative phase of development has been our excessive extroversion of consciousness. When speaking of extroversion and introversion among peoples, Jung graphically and forcefully stated that America is extroverted like hell. Thus, the prevailing attitude of this country makes it understandable that extroverted and consequently simple-minded and reductionistic approaches should prevail here when it comes to creative social and economic change. Just think of it. A supposedly religious, idealistic nation which is ever proclaiming its ideals and spiritual commitments, at the same time always gives priority to economic and material considerations when it comes to social development. Isn't this quite the same thing that the Marxists do when they look upon history as being determined exclusively by economic forces? Thus we have reformers, the potential agents of the incipient integrative phase of psychohistory, addressing themselves first and foremost to the economic structure of the culture. By attacking and understanding the 19th century of free market economy, or what was classically called economic liberalism, these reformers start at the very worst place. By attacking the freedom of the marketplace, they have almost succeeded in killing the goose that laid the golden egg of America's economic power and prosperity. The result is confusion, the diminishing of economic resources within the individual sphere, and the collective growth of the welfare state. Not a development conducive to an enhancement of consciousness and individuation, to be sure. What has happened, of course, is that the economic cart was tackled before the psychological horse. The spiritually natural order of priorities was reversed because of the extroverted and implicitly materialistic attitude of consciousness prevailing in the minds of the leaders and thinkers of the society. What we have neglected is the psychological fact that useful advances in culture must begin at the level of the mind, rather than at the level of physical conditions. Jung put it very well when he said, "Every advance in a culture is psychologically an extension of consciousness, a coming to consciousness that can take place only through discrimination. Therefore, an advance always begins with individuation, that is to say, with the individual, conscious of his isolation, cutting a new path towards hitherto untrodden territory." We are then currently in America dealing with a pioneering effort of consciousness, cutting through previously untrodden territory, which to a large extent must occur at the individual level and primarily psychologically. The thrust of this movement toward growth must be psychological rather than economic or political. In this respect, both the left and the right, the liberal and the conservative positions, are in serious need of rethinking their premises and methods. They must abandon their materialism and excessive extroversion and acquire a psychological sense, which they so woefully lack. Changes, if they are to be creative, lasting, and consistent with the psycho-historical needs of the culture, must start in consciousness. Motivations for social transformation. The only recent development that creatively combined social and psychological change may have been the upsurgence of new consciousness in the 1960s and 70s, when a counter or underground culture of unprecedented magnitude grew up within the majority culture. In spite of its many shortcomings, the counterculture brought to the fore tremendously transformative and liberating forces of far-reaching dimensions. It is easy and frequently done to reduce the developments of the 1960s and 70s to such factors as drug use, rock music, communal living situations, unusual and distinctive forms of dress, and the flaunting of previously sacrosanct sexual mores. But I think these superficialities have very little to do with what really happened at this curiously transformative period of our history. Robert Evans, in Belief and Counterculture, defined the motivations which played the greatest role within and behind the developments of the 60s and 70s as follows. 1. Priority of experience and subjective involvement in experience. 2. Recovery of mystery and restoration of creativity. 3. Concern for communication and the symbolic dimension. And 4. Revitalization of community and openness to transcendence. In the following, we shall look very briefly at some of these motivations to see how valuable they might be and why there has been such a tremendous reaction against them on the part of religious crusaders who feel threatened by the changes in consciousness in our culture. Let us begin with what Evans termed the priority of experience. What is experience? True experience is a rare bird in our world, and particularly in our culture as it has developed. Why is this so? Because our culture, from a certain time on, became geared to what might be called substitutional experience, rather than to direct experience. Technology is one factor involved in this shift, but the real culprit is a state of mind characterized by an exaltation of the thinking function. Some people, who are opposed to the trend of substitutional experience in our culture, have become enraged at technology. This reaction is definitely misguided. Technology is not behind all that has gone wrong in America. Technology cannot really do anything to us unless large psychological factors are also involved. No doubt, technology supplied us with the tools of substitutionalism, but it did not supply the motive, for that was psychological. The motives behind the rise of substitutional experience were supplied by very old and dark unconscious patterns of the mind, which predate technology by millennia. Without a doubt, the Semitic God concept of Old Jehovah had much to do with it. From this worldview, we learned that substitutional experience is either immoral or at least dangerously bordering on immorality. As a result of psychological developments of long standing, the substitutional experience has become the normative experience. Truth has become abstract and theoretical in lieu of what it should be, namely concrete and existential. Modern psychological research, especially that of Jung, has brought back to us the emphasis we need on the importance of psychology over abstract meaning, and consequently on existential over theoretical truth. Through depth psychology, we are beginning to find that there is really no truth out there in the region of abstractions, but only truth within ourselves. In a sense, it might be said that there is no truth as such, but only my truth as it occurs within the existential and phenomenological reality of my own interior being. The truth, derived from the substantial experience, is, of course, diametrically opposed to such valid psychological recognitions. Michael Novak, in The Experience of Nothingness, has said, "The accusations of the counterculture are not attacks upon intelligent, accurate understandings or good judgment, but upon the myth of objectivity as too narrow an expression of reason which leaves out of consideration too many delicate but crucial operations of human intelligence." The myth of objectivity is, of course, intimately connected with the issue of substitutional experience. Long before the contemporary counterculture, Carl Jung exploded the myth of objectivity on the basis of depth psychology. He said, in effect, that what most people conceive of as objective is in reality the most subjective thing in the world. Why? Because it is chock full of the projections of the observer. Most people, because of their relative lack of integrated consciousness, are well nigh incapable of anything resembling objective observations and judgment. Only a highly individuated person who has accomplished a great measure of the integration of the conscious and unconscious elements in his or her psyche is capable of true objectivity. Until that point is reached, we inevitably find a great deal of unassimilated unconscious content projecting itself into our field of vision. We think that we are being objective, but in reality, we are mistaking our projections for objective reality. Our quest for true objectivity is thus another manifestation of the striving for direct experience. However, we must remember in this context that many people in society are threatened by the possibility of direct experience and of true psychological objectivity. There are always people about who have vested interests in the normative character of substitutional experience, people who in some way derive profit from the fact that direct experience is not available or not considered right. These people, ranging from television preachers to police commissioners, are committed to denying people the freedom to create and experience their own reality. When we are able to experiment with alternative modalities of feeling and of behavior, then these and similar merchants of the existing established models will begin to lose out. The second important element which the counterculture has brought forth is what Evans calls the recovery of mystery and creativity. What really happened is that people discovered once again that to address themselves to the mysterious and to the creative recesses of the unconscious is a vital and real task. That without mystery and creativity, life is not worthwhile. Here too, the advocates of old-time religion felt threatened. For many centuries, they have attempted to exorcise the elements of mystery and creativity from the life of our culture. To them, creativity is a sacrilegious attempt to duplicate the creation ability of their God. There has been one creation already, and that is quite enough, or so they think. And what mysteries does the human being need that are not covered by the Bible? Human beings are supposed to be creatures and not creators in the eyes of such folk, and mysteries are simply not needed. Thank you. The perennial Gnostic striving for mystery and for creativity is thus anathema indeed to all advocates of old-time unconscious religiosity. The third motivation mentioned by Evans is concern for communication and the symbolic dimension. With the recovery of the symbolic dimension comes what one may call the transvaluation of symbols. Unconscious religiosity of the old-time variety has its own symbols and makes the most of them for its own benefit. The unconscious of humanity is ruled by symbols, but when symbols are not consciously understood, they become tyrants and idols in one's life. For example, the issues of abortion and birth control are assuredly symbolic, which is why unconscious old-time religious harps on them with such persistence and vehemence. What is the symbol behind these issues? It is the archetype of the great devouring mother, an unconscious archetype of nature and of natural law. The dynamism of the great mother wants to give birth, no matter what the conditions or what the birth might do to the psychological or material welfare of the potential parents. The mother will not be thwarted or interfered with. It is important to note that the emotionalism and blind unconsciousness of some extreme devotees of the ecology and nature movement are similar in their effect to religious unconsciousness. Ecological extremism and right-to-life fanaticism are brothers underneath their unconscious skins. Both may reflect unconscious worship of what appears to them the supreme value, life. But some may forget that life without consciousness is a blind, brutal surge, a force without direction or purpose, a torrent of energy coming from no place and going nowhere. Thus, the devouring and birth-giving mother as a huge, unconscious archetype looms over the symbolic issues of birth control and abortion. From this awesome symbol of the collective unconscious, issues relating to human reproduction derive their power and relevance. And hasn't the Church been called since earliest times Mater Ecclesia, Mother Church? Placating a powerful archetype is the problem of the unconscious level, which, being unconscious, is of course not recognized. When individuating, conscious persons begin to strive for their own symbolic reality. They run up against the tyrannical influence of the great unconscious symbols which have been enshrined by various religious establishments, whose adherents have simply worshipped what they did not understand. Today, many persons are seeking once more for the symbols of the transformation which arise from a deeper level of personal experience. For such symbols to be transformative, they have to be realized at an individual and personal level. That is why so many individuals were and are not satisfied with the established symbol systems of our culture, but seek the amplification of their symbolic quest in various non-establishment symbols, such as tarot cards, astrological signs, magical sigils, mandalas, and the like. All this activity is, of course, anathema to those who feel that the old rugged cross is all one can possibly need as a meaningful symbol of life. The fourth motivation mentioned by Evans is the revitalization of community, and the openness to transcendence within a community. Communitarianism, we must remember, is by no means the same as communism. The commune or community need not be an expression of collective mass-mindedness, although it often becomes just that. Individuals must be able to make decisions as to what kind of community or communalism they wish to be a part of. They must not be forced into a community by external pressures, by the secret police and the commissar, as it were, but freely choose or create communal situations on the basis of their personal predilections and interests. Thus, the communist system says to people, I am your community, and you had better accept this community, or else. In a somewhat similar manner, old-time unconscious religion says, we have a society that is pleasing unto God as it is, and you had better accept it as it is, and behave within it or else. The great difference is, however, that in our society, with its constitutional freedoms, an individual is at least legally free to tell an old-time preacher and their kith and kin to go to Hades, and to go about choosing his or her own communal associations on the basis of personal preference, compatibility, and so forth. At this point in time, the countercultural trends of the 60s and 70s, along with other developments, have produced what might be called a revolt against the old symbolic structures and community ideals by emerging pluralistic models of community, which are based on freely chosen personal relatedness and the relationships of sovereign individuals. These new communities are supplanting the much more unconscious archetypal community bonding based on ties of blood and nation. The frantic cries about saving the family, as well as the mindless supra-patriotism evident among religious crusaders, can be explained as a reaction against this trend. Certainly, no one would claim that there is no place in society for family, but by the same token, one must recognize that there are valid forms of association which are based on conscious considerations rather than on unconscious and choiceless belonging to a group. If consciousness is worth more than unconsciousness, and if choice is preferable to a lack of choice, then there must be a possibility of communities freely entered into, which may supersede and even replace the natural, but thereby unconscious unit of family. A family is a fine thing, to be sure, but conscious persons may find values that are superior to those of the family. Similarly, an intelligent conscious patriotism is a commendable position, But with the growth of consciousness, it is quite likely that supranational values and loyalties may also make themselves felt in the psyche of the individual. Combating the threats to freedom. To summarize our psycho-historical analysis of the present assault on the changes in consciousness and morality, we note again that these changes are conceived by some religious crusaders as heralding the ultimate moral degradation and downfall of America. Their efforts represent a resistance of unconscious, archaic forces against the growing trends towards individuation and the growth of consciousness in our age. The Moloch of mass-mindedness once again appears to be demanding a sacrifice of our personal selfhood and our right to individual choices. Today and any day, it is incumbent on those who cherish personal freedom and the opportunities for free spiritual growth to realize that threats to freedom are to be taken seriously, whether they come from the quarters of Marxism or from those of a homegrown politicized religiosity. The tyranny of Marxist collectivism and the would-be religious control of the moral climate and personal lives of the citizens of our country are both cut from the same psychological cloth. Both are expressions of the primitive unconscious. The lords of the Kremlin, the bloodthirsty fanatics of Cambodia, the religious butchers of Iran, and the self-righteous politicized television preachers of our country are instruments of the same psychological forces. They are anti-individuational and collectivist in their thrust, primitive soul-killing forces bent upon establishing and preserving their own power, which is rooted in the dark impulses and sub-rational needs of the unconscious. What is the relationship of these anti-individual forces to conservatism? Observed from a historical perspective, these movements are the antithesis of real conservatism. In my view, true conservatism is always libertarian rather than authoritarian in its emphasis. Modern conservative philosophy originated with the English philosopher Edmund Burke, who, repelled by the excesses of the French Revolution, established a spiritual orientation rooted in conserving the values of the past, combined with a profound respect for the dignity and freedom of the individual. Burke's conservatism was thus libertarian conservatism, which opposed the reign of terror in France and similar phenomena on the basis of a regard for individual liberty against collective terror and tyranny. We need to recognize in this context, of course, that conservatism and progressivism are neither more nor less than expressions of the eternally present principle of pairs of opposites in the world. When we become exceedingly attached to one member of the pair to the exclusion of the other, we create a dangerous imbalance. Moreover, the conditions, values, and situations of the past need to be conserved. Out of the old comes the new. If we want to hatch chickens, we must preserve the eggs and not break and devour them before the chickens have a chance to hatch. Revolutionaries are all too often breaking the eggs of the past, and thus find themselves without a creative and promising future. All too often they use up their historical credit by doing away with the elements of the past. Then they are left with nothing, except perhaps some cultural eggshells. On the other hand, it is obvious that things are not wonderful and worthy of eternal life just because they are old. Old things can be quite useless, although not necessarily so. Thus, for real change to take place, we must adopt neither an unconscious conservatism that hangs on to anything that is old for dear life, nor a mindful, compulsive progressivism that pursues change for the sheer joy of change. What America needs are individuals who are capable of balanced, conscious choices, freely arrived at and peacefully and freely implemented within the framework of a flexible, libertarian society. In contrast, the design intentions, and more particularly the methods of the politicized religionists in our midst are characterized by, at best, a pseudo-conservatism. It should be apparent to all insightful and philosophical conservatives of the Burkean variety that it is uncoming to their position and stature to be bedfellows of the vulgar primitivism and the potential collective tyranny of those who mindlessly serve the archaic unconscious archetypes of past ages, who are willing to sacrifice to these archetypes the greatest value to be conserved in our society, namely freedom. One more point needs to be raised here: the issue of morality, under the banner of which so much nonsense is propagandized today. A conscious psychological attitude toward ethical issues always distinguishes between two kinds of morality, individual and public. Religions the world over can address themselves with the same degree of legitimacy to individual morality. Based on their particular metaphysical models of reality, various religions can establish guidelines and occasionally quite rigid commandments regarding the ways individuals ought to behave in order to live in harmony with a particular metaphysical reality. Religious authorities have always felt that the regulation, or at least the influencing of the moral behavior of individual believers, was within their province. As long as these ethical maxims are accepted more or less freely by individuals within a particular religious context, this is really no more than the proper exercise of personal freedom and choice. The difficulty arises, however, when religious believers and their leaders who fail to distinguish between private and public morality assume that what they consider to be the right standards of behaviors for themselves ought to be the right standards for all persons in the community or the society at large. What happens when religious morality, intended for the use of the individual, is foisted on the entire body politic? The result is that the growth and development of consciousness in such a society is greatly restricted. Consciousness grows not by right behavior, but by behavior that is the result of free, conscious decisions and choices. Real morality involves freedom. This is the mystery of the Christian teaching of free will, so egregiously abused and misunderstood by Christians themselves. Free will is a valuable psychological teaching when properly understood. According to this teaching, God has not exercised the prerogative of forcing human beings into a path of virtue, but instead gave humans the supreme opportunity of choice. Free will is an accepted doctrine of the Christian faith. However, these implications are often ignored by the self-appointed guardians of Christian morality, who forever try to improve on the method adopted by the deity by attempting to force their private morality and commandments upon society by way of legislation, law enforcement, and other forms of coercion. Isn't it curious that while God gave humanity a choice, God's devout servants are busily trying to take that same choice away? Somewhere within the tangled structures of theology and biblical exegesis is concealed a forgotten, all-important truth, that God offered humans a choice because God desired them to grow and not merely to remain fixed in one condition, even if that condition is obedience to God's law. Ironically, God did not force people to obey divine laws, but God's servant attempted to do just that. The chief characteristic of increasing individuation within society is choice, which includes the exercise of free will. Morality in such an instance is increasingly a private concern, and public laws and regulations are restricted to a sphere in which they are motivated by the realistic welfare of the community and not by abstract and theoretical considerations of right and wrong. Every religious organization has its moral and ethical doctrines. Dogma, morals, and ritual are the inevitable trinity of any religious system. It would be foolish to demand or even to wish that churches and synagogues not teach some form of morality. What needs to be kept in mind, however, is that a religious group can claim the right to impose its regulations and laws only upon its own members, who abide by them by their own free choice. When the moral strictures and religious laws of a particular sect are elevated to the status of secular law and are enforced on all citizens of whatever belief or none, then we are unquestionably in the grip of a tyranny. Libertarian and free-thinking individuals frequently make the mistake of wishing to dictate to various groups and individuals ways in which they should accord more freedom to their believers and followers. However, as long as a group's followers obey the dictates of their superiors as a result of their own free choice, they must be accorded the privilege of obedience or unfreedom, even as others must be given the choice of freedom. No one can presume to tell the Pope to approve of abortion or birth control or any other policy. After all, if someone does not like the policies of the Pope, he or she can easily leave the Roman Catholic Church and find a more congenial religious conviction. If the Hare Krishna movement, Rajneesh, or another spiritual leader imposes curious regulations on his or her followers, that is their own business. But when religious folk move surreptitiously, or as now is often the case, brazenly, into the process of legislation, into government or the courts, and demand that their particular and private morality be made public law, binding for all, then they must be told in no uncertain terms that they are wrong. If that is not enough, they ought to be prevented by all lawful means from carrying out their ill-advised designs. Finally, I think it is high time that matters of social morality and behavior be viewed in a historical and even a psychohistorical perspective. It is easy to become excessively concerned over some real or imagined evil in society and furiously demand regulations and changes to address this condition. When separated from their larger historical context, many conditions appear momentous and disastrous. Thus, people can get exercised over what seems to be the erosion of the moral fiber of the nation, or the deterioration or the moral standards of the culture. A lack of historical perspective always brings with it a lack of proportion. Issues tend to become inflated and distorted. Mountains and molehills are confused. Minor matters appear bigger than life. Out of such conditions come intemperate policies, unwise decisions, hasty and oppressive legislation, and, in their wake, social conditions which take many years to remedy and which make for the oppression of unborn generations. All of this comes about because people have no sense of history, no way of evaluating their present concerns and perplexities in the light of the past. The historical roots of our present political religious concerns are readily discernible to the informed eye. The founders of the American Republic were men of the era of the Enlightenment, who were zealously guarding the newfound freedoms of the individual soul and mind from the renewed encroachments of archaic unconscious forces. As previously stated, the separation of church and state was a great historical landmark guaranteeing the emancipation of the human ego from the tyranny of the unconscious archetypes. Enlightenment means the coming of the light of the conscious ego and the receding of the collective, murky unconsciousness. Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, the enlightened Freemason and spiritual libertarians wished to bring about a social setting in which free minds and souls could grow and individuate according to the laws of their inner being, without domination by psychological structures carried over from the Middle Ages, which had outlived their usefulness. Today, the descendants of these enlightened founders have, for the most part, lost their psychological connection with the intentions of these wise men, who, despite their powdered wigs and lace cuffs, were mapping out a plan of individuation, spiritual growth, and freedom unprecedented in the recorded history of our world. We have allowed the myopia of the present to rob us of the consciousness of our past, and thus we are in a great danger of forfeiting our future. The keynote of this noble experiment of the Enlightenment that became the United States of America was and is not morality or Judeo-Christian rectitude, although these were, of course, part of the heritage of the American people, but rather it was always choice. Choice has made thousands of religions and philosophies flourish side by side on American soil. Choice brought free public education to all the children of the people. Choice has produced an economy that facilitated a standard of living unknown anywhere on the globe in any era of history. The opportunity of choice has been the great, and in many ways, the unique gift of the gods to the people of this land. This is not to say that there were and are not great imperfections and inequities commingling with the element of choice. One was slavery, with its still present results. Another was the ill treatment of the native population of the land. Social and historical ills and evil have existed and persist here in abundance. Still, the glorious element of choice has always worked its way forward and onward through the darkness and the evils. I like to nourish the hope that choice, or I might say freedom, is still with us and is still moving forward on the pathway of history. Western culture is the only culture in history that has taken time seriously, and thus has managed to achieve consciousness and autonomy from the vast, unconscious dragon and its tyranny. It is true that this autonomy has been costly, and that now, in the dawning integrative phase of psychohistory, we must placate and understand the dragon once again. In time, and within the context of a consciously realized history, we must make our peace with the dragon. As individuated heroes of consciousness, we must descend into the underworld, into the caverns where the dragons dwell. Carrying the torch of consciousness, we must illuminate the murky labyrinths of the psyche and bring forth the treasures guarded by the great worms of the mind. For the first time in many thousands of years, we have the tools and the equipment to do this, and on a fairly large scale. Tools of information and education are available to us, which previous generations and civilizations lacked. But to do this work, we must be free. We must not be deprived of the great treasure bequeathed to us by the wise men of old. We must continue to possess choice. Without choice, our heroic quest shall be in vain. Without choice, the torch of our consciousness will lose its illuminating flame. Without choice, our history will have occurred in vain. Our struggles and battles will have been to no purpose. Today, as ever, there are those who would deprive us of our opportunity of choice. Some of these enemies of choice are wrapped in the red banner of Marxism, and others, incredibly, wrap themselves in the Star-Spangled Banner itself. Some would rob us of the choice of consciousness in the name of dialectical materialism, while others would do so in the name of the Bible. The curious irony of all this is that many of these people are filled with good intentions. Some wish to erase poverty, and others to do away with crime and vice. In their own fashion, they too strive for the good. Still, I say, they must be resisted strenuously, vigilantly, and mightily. We cannot compromise with those who would take away from us the prize of choice. We may not have a just society or a virtuous society, but we must have a society where choice is possible. We may not be wealthy or healthy or righteous, but we can be free. We may not have the guarantee of ease or of happiness or of salvation, but we have the opportunity of growth, and for this we must continue to strive, and this we must defend.